Thank you for the nice introduction. So just wanted to quickly understand the audience. So how many of you guys are programmers? Okay, the whole room. I have to ask the other one. Okay, I'm assuming everyone is Unity? Okay, okay. Another question is, how many of you guys have worked for more than 5 years on Unity? Second. Okay, that's a lot of audience. Okay, awesome. How many of you guys are making games for low-end Android handsets? Everyone, that's good. So that's the India audience, primarily what we're talking about. So the talk, as it says, it's targeting 60 FPS, but primarily it's on URP. And how many of you guys use URP? Oh yeah, okay, very nice. That's a lot of good audience. So understanding what 60 FPS is, it's all on computing time, right? You have to figure out from your profiling. Now, Unity, how many of you guys use a profiler in Unity? Very good, so good. So just studying from the profiling data itself, it's all about where your compute time is. And 60 FPS is basically 16 milliseconds. Anything lower than that, around that, great. For extremely low-end handsets, you're looking close to 30 milliseconds if you can get in. If you get 30 milliseconds, you're good. And always as a question is your performance, is it CPU bound or is it GPU bound? And that's the first mistake usually most developers, including me, we do. You have to figure out whenever you're stuck, say, there's some throttling happening at some spot in your game, is it CPU bound or GPU bound? And that everything relates to a single parameter is you look at the profile data and you look where the performance is getting eaten up. Okay, you plug in through you figure out from a GPU, you figure out from a CPU time, you look through all of that stuff, you look whether the physics is taking in, whether it's animation taking in, is it a particle effect? A lot of things across Unity which would cause the throttling effect, what's there. And today's talk is going to cover a little bit on areas on specific to URP and where, say, from the low end to the high end, where you will see different bottlenecks and how we address them in some of our projects over the years. And since we migrated to URP, we migrated to URP about last year. So some of our projects from the last 2 years have been on URP. So this is more about our knowledge and figuring out where where we have experienced issues in. And every LTS version, not to say that everyone I'm assuming have used in, every LTS version is buggy in Unity. There is no longer a LTS, right? You're looking through, you're writing on forums to figure out, hey, which version is the least buggy? Is my particle system throttling in this, or is my animation, breaking on that? You're looking through that, right? We use the last, meaning I would say the most happy version for us is 2021 3.9 F1, and it's a specific number where we have found it's the least buggy in terms of, say, loading times. We had loading issues on some of the earlier versions. The latest version just breaks everything. We use addressables, we use everything, and we have a lot of game objects. We have in our scene close to about almost 2 lakh game objects in our scene. And it's all been culled. It's a huge hierarchy. We do occlusion onto it. There's a lot of stuff onto it. But we realized some of these versions are extremely slow on loading as well. And while loading helps with performance, I'll come to that as well when we talk about. But yes, main thing in mind, profile, look at your milliseconds and look whether it is CPU or GPU bound. That's the one major thing. Now, with URP, the new pipeline is you have to use a renderable pipeline asset. And how we address it is we use different pipeline assets for different devices and for different configurations as well. So when we start the game, we instantly analyze, we run a small check, we see how many milliseconds are we getting. Everything is happening behind the loading screen as well. We check how many on a blank screen we are getting in. We take that, there's an intelligence built. We look at the RAM, the processor, the cores. We look at Android version. We look at the chipset. We look at what compression does it support. With that, we are able to create kind of a matrix on where this device is, and then we break it up into more or less like 6 buckets, starting from a very, very low end, and it keeps going up till the ultra, till the highest end. So we kind of break this down. Everything happens just before the game starts. And then, depending on that, we assign different pipeline assets. So what is it that? As everyone knows, on the URP, it comes with default as the rendering pipeline assets. Never use the default. Go towards it and configure it. The first step when you start off with the project is go at it, create multiple pipeline assets with different settings, and configure the first. That's the first thing you should do for the project, because that's where your first set of performance starts in. On an empty project, set that part. Now, what does it have? One is controls your quality on the assets. So you can define different things onto it, including your asset loading time. At the last part, if you can see, there is an async asset upload, where you can look from your, if you have a lot of game objects, sort of heavy scenery built in, if you haven't, that will help. If there's a throttling happening on that, whether you'll require more than, say, there's a 20 millisecond buffer what it creates onto every chunk when it's loading the data in. So if you want to increase that, the default is set at 16. You can increase it to 32. It will help you in faster loading as well. So you'll have to look at the profiling and see, hey, for the low end, I will need a bigger buffer or a smaller buffer, depending on your game objects as well, in terms of loading it. And the others, you have to configure that data. The profile will tell you all of the data. Just look at, there is an asset loading profiler. Just look at that and you can understand where your loading takes place. But apart from that, from a rendering point of view, right from say, do you have to use different, what's your shadow is going to be? Do you look at what your materials is, what your other stuff on the parameter stuff? It's a pretty straightforward on what we use, and we, like for the higher end and all the stuff, we force obviously anisotropic filtering. There's a lot of anti-aliasing and all of that stuff, and everything is configurable on this, and according to it, we load different types of assets. We call up a different addressable asset, and we load in depending on the different configuration side of it. So yes, this again can be set up. Again, we do it on the loading, and we change it during the setting. We have a setting section also inside the game. So during then, whenever you change it, it completely changes your pipeline asset. For the low end and for the very low, we use half res on the texture size as well. And so it kind of helps you with the texture memory on the whole per se. And speaking about texture, which I'll cover later, is something we have to figure out is how does a low-end handset, specifically extreme low-end Android handset, what chip does it have to allow you to use compressed textures? Most of the advanced chipsets nowadays, right, let it be ODM and from the Qualcomm team over here, and they're better at storing compressed textures in memory. And it decompresses it stores them. There's a texture area, and it uses it as a buffer. So it's real-time decompressing, using it near a buffer and putting it back in. But that only happens on certain chipsets. Qualcomm including one of them. There are other chipsets which does it, but some of them just don't support. There'll be a lot of throttling on, say, the low and extreme low-end Android handsets specifically. They will. It's better to keep them uncompressed and loaded in memory so that it's very fast. And all of this is critical because when your game is running, you really don't want a single stop in frame rate, right? Now, we launched a recent game right now on the Ram Setu movie. We did an endless runner. And endless runner is, I would say, it's very close to even an FPS game because it's all on performance. If it starts, there are hiccups during the game and stuff like that, people just hate it. It needs to be smooth, it needs to be fast, consistent, and the worst is the heating. Okay, it shouldn't heat. People play endless runners like our average people who play, and they play for almost 50 minutes in a single session. Okay, so your game needs to run 50 minutes without heating at all, and it needs to run on 60 FPS. So that's the challenge in terms of where your decision on whether it needs to be a compressed texture, does it need to be uncompressed, what do you decide before you load up the game. These are the different things what you have to take up, and I will cover more ahead as well. One critical thing on default, the pixel lighting is on, per pixel lighting. Again, in the renderable asset, you can set it. So what we do is on the low end and so per pixel lighting is the most beautiful way of rendering, right? You look at how the shading happens on the character or on the environment, how the light affects the entire beautiful gradient or the Phong shading, how it appears. All of those are all the beautiness of per pixel shading, right? But it's really expensive for very low end devices. So first things is what we do is we push everything to vertex lighting, okay, on the very low lighting. So there will be the problem with pushing to the performance gains on vertex lighting is massive, but it's immediately your entire scene, which is set by the artist, it looks really bad. Okay, all the lighting, what you imagine to set the scene, and it's worse when you have baked it as well. So you're going to have these challenges. Again, it's all part of the pre-production phase. When you set up your project in, you have to sit with the artist and figure out, look, I need to set up only vertex lighting. I need to set up, so let's first optimize for vertex lighting. Let's figure out, you start off from the ground up, you look how your scene looks up for vertex lighting. And then that will ensure, like for the very low end handsets, it's been taken care of. And specifically for very low Android handsets, right? You have to make sure, one, vertex lighting is enabled for them. That's what we do on a pipeline asset. Additional lights. Now, additional lights, again, we usually set for the medium configuration, we set it at vertex. Additional lights are always vertex for us. We don't do per pixel only for the high, very high and the ultra. It's always at the beautiness of per pixel lighting on all our lights. And we support close to about 3 lights maximum. All are directional, nothing else. And all are directional, all are real time. We didn't bake anything for our requirement right now because on an endless runner, you are kind of moving the asset, and we wanted to change provide different lighting and effect because there are a lot of cinematic scenes. We wanted everything to be real time. So all are high end and all of the stuff, everything is on the real time lighting end. But important thing from the low end, again, is switch on vertex lighting. That's the key on the main part. The shadow, now we'll talk next on the shadow part, but the shadow resolution is critical now. And the high, what we realized from high to ultra, most chipsets can take a 4K texture. Okay, it's that's what our data tells us, is like anywhere from, so any 14,000, 15,000 rupee handset, you take in all the plethora of handsets nowadays, most is purchases 14, 15,000 handsets. So you have two buckets, how I look at it. The very low ones are usually the 8.5K handset, the sub $100 handset, which will run Android 11 out of the box. It'll have maybe a 2 GB RAM, and it starts with a 32 GB storage. Okay, and these are your really popular handsets, right from manufacturers like Infinix and Redmi, the 9 or the 10 series. They all are 8.5K handsets, and they're really popular, meaning they have more than 1 lakh ratings on Flipkart, and they're all 4.5 stars. So the thing is, all of these handsets is what India, the mass grassroots level gamers, they play. So for them, and all of those handsets will support vertex lighting brilliantly. Okay, and they will support, some of them are good, they have good chipsets built in, a lot of them MediaTek, but they will support, say, 4K textures on the shadowing as well. So, but for us, what we do is, if it's a particular RAM, to be on the safer side, we make sure, like if it's a 2 GB handset and on a multiple configuration, we usually push them towards medium or low. We don't take the risk of pushing it to high. That's something we should do. But main is it supports a 4K shadowing resolution, which will help us when addressing shadows. Now, shadows is the main thing about shadows. It makes your game look nice. How many of you guys use real-time shadows in your game? Yeah, it's less. It's tough. How many of you? Then I'm assuming everyone is using baked. Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So that's something, or maybe what light probes, as more or less. So for shadows, one main thing is the good thing about real-time shadows is on URP, specifically with the URP pipeline, uh, the shadows work really well from the medium to the high end settings. Okay, and you'll be surprised that it'll work on really low end handsets as well. It's great for performance. It looks nice, and it's not that expensive as well if you follow some basic steps on setting up your on your shadows. So one major thing is your max distance, what is there on your quality settings, right? Default it's set as 50, okay, which is good. Now, depending on your game, if it's a fighting game, or you can even get it down to maybe 20 or maybe 30. If it's an isometric game, you can get it down lower as well. Depends on how far your camera is with regards to what you're rendering, okay? And the closer it is, the lesser distance you can set. And when the lesser distance is set, it's nothing but your resolution of the shadows becomes more accurate. It's less pixelated. It looks clean. Okay, and it's all depending on where your camera is positioned with what FOV, obviously, but how it's closer to your subject. Okay, so it depends on that. And 50 is a good number because ultimately, what is shadows? Shadows is nothing but a big, depending on the depth, it just creates a big two-dimensional image, right? It's processing all of the data. It's putting in a big map, and it's generating that map from the low to the high, right? From the depth, as you say, from the depth buffer, what's going to use that. So the more closer, the better. So if there is a character which is near to the camera, you want that very nice silhouette on the shadows, just make sure 50 is a good number, and with a 4K resolution. But the second most important thing, if you have a large scenery and you want, say, a shadow to a particular distance, then the cascading helps. And cascading is, again, you have to, now cascading again helps in creating different shadow maps for different distances. It calculates it in that way. So we usually, for our high to very high settings, we use 3 on the shadowing map. There's not much difference between 3 and 4, but 3 is a max. 3 gives you a good result because 3, we make sure, like, when the character is standing, the nearby area, the plants, the rocks, and the character, they get all the beautiful high resolution texture. And remember, most of your screen is our target is mobile devices. So we don't do PC. So all of this setup works great for a mobile screen, right? Which is small. So ultimately, when you look at the screen, it's this small. Okay. So, and the maximum, if your character is really close, then your character and the nearby scenery is almost 50% of your entire screen area. Okay. So the first cascade, what you get, should be configured, give them the largest screen space. Okay, so give them, like, hey, in the texture map, what's there in, give it more area. Then the middle, then if you want is a vast level scene, then you give the next next cascade count, you assign it a little bit more area, little bit more texture area. And all this is configured by every cascade. You can configure those values, play around, ask your artist to look at it and to see, and you can adjust, you can cover a very large distance shadows, okay, for a whole scenery on real time, and it works brilliantly. So again, we configure all of this for different handsets. So from a medium, high, very high, ultra, and everything, we fiddle around with this. We figure out what, a lot of them are OLED screens nowadays, so they look more and more crisper. Even the second batch looks nicer, even the third batch looks nicer. So you'll have to, like, fiddle around what setting you can, but we spend a lot of area on making sure that the shadow from a cascade count is set up properly or not. For the extreme low handsets, we switch it off. There is no real time at all. Because shadows on real time is a good wish to ask for, but you're never going to get it. And so we have to make sure, like, for our extremely low end, stuff, we completely switch it off. We use blob shadows, but we also do one process on the environment. We do complete fake shadows on our environment. The artist will hate it because we take a tree, we take a rock, and we place artificial shadows beneath the surface. All the contact shadows are all built manually from the artist side. A lot of them are prefab, so we make sure like any rock, any tree, everything is placed in. It automatically places a shadow beneath that as a contact object in. But that's a manual process, and that's something which you have to do to get to. Please put in shadows, but make sure, like for the low end, you have to do a manual work onto it. That's what we do. From the next part is now coming from the shadows to the actual lights. So when you're configuring a scenery, you have to have multiple layers, okay, on your scenery. You have to decide which objects need to cast, because if you're using real-time shadows, which objects have to cast shadows, which objects shouldn't. Do you want trees to put in? Do you want the player, the enemies, the obstacles, the far-off mountains, do they have to cast shadows or not? All of these things you have to configure it. Now we have close to 2 lakh objects, 200K objects in a scene. So we have to be really critical to figure out which objects can cast shadows, which objects shouldn't. But we have to be like very clear, like most in all our 2 lakh objects, most of those objects do cast shadows. It's not like they don't. But you have to be little clear, like which are the ones which are casting it. You have to decide which will take a larger map as well, because if it depends on the light direction as well, right? If a light direction is almost towards an evening light setting, and it's going to cast you these long shadows, and long shadows, avoid them, is what I would say, because long shadows will cause you those aliasing effect. And so if you have a long tower casting a long shadow, and if it's near, then it's great, but it's far, it's going to look extremely pixelated in your walking distance. So avoid maximum long shadow light direction. So you can kind of negotiate with our artist, hey, let's put it in an afternoon setting. It'll help me the game look better. But that's something which is important from art perspective as well. But what we also do is we group one very important thing for doing a player shadow is we group the ground and the character together. So that's something which we do. So they are on we cast our shadow lights only on the ground surface and the character and anything on it. So this helps us to cast the real time, because the shadow has to fall on the ground, right? We don't cast shadows on the nearby rock or on the tree, the player shadow. We avoid that. But we make sure like it's only on the ground and it's only on the character. So that's a separate layer. And then the characters have different light settings anyways. Our characters have 3 lights, all from different directions, serving a different purpose to get the shading. There's a leather objects, there's a metal object. So we try to like make sure like there are multiple sides to highlight those different props on the body as well. But our characters usually have about the 3 lights, and the entire environment we have 2 lights. The reason of doing that is on a single light, the issue with specifically on medium handsets, right? We have noticed like some of the times the shader rendering on some of these handsets, they're quite broken, and they will make the objects appear very dark. Okay, so you're going to see one side well lit and the other side is extreme. It's make sure like, and they are non-OLED screens, so it's going to look even more darker on those handsets. The panels are bad, some of those LCD panels. So you have to make sure like some of them, they are lit on the opposite direction as well, so that they are lit up nicely. But we make sure like 2 environments onto it. But another thing on the light is important and not important. Not important is almost free lighting, meaning you can apply not important lights on different scenarios, colored lights, anything. It's almost like URP will beautifully handle it, take it care for you. Important, when you want to show the metallic and all of those different surfaces, you need all of those important lights in, and shadows obviously casted on important lights. But not important helps. So do check from your game what your game really requires. If it doesn't require important light, It's great because one is for sure, it takes a lot of computation to calculate those lighting in the first place. And if you have a game which a player is going to play, say, for a half an hour session, or in our games, like they play for more than half an hour session, then not important lights will help in your thermal throttling. Okay, so make sure, like, if you really need those important lights to really showcase it, look from the device, because ultimately you play the game not like this, you're playing it far away, right? So just look at it, it'll help you from the heating issues if it's a not important setting. But yes, we do change again depending on the entire hierarchy. Low end, all a low end is all not important. We don't is important at all. So all a low end, very low end, they all are not important, along with your vertex lighting. So coming to the main, I would say the dragon in the room. It's all about set pass calls. So set pass calls, again, set pass calls is the most important parameter when you're looking at, hey, how are all the game objects in your screen batched up? Okay, and below 100 is a good number. 50 is excellent, and if you get 30, you can pat yourself on the back, meaning you have achieved really a great result. But main thing is to see is how do you, when you have so much of geometry on the scene, how do you configure it to have the least set of calls, set pass calls? And it's a difficult thing because it's when we have when multiple artists are working on a single scene, you have to make sure, like, hey, now two people cannot work on the same texturing, right? If one person is working onto it, if he's working on a part of land, part of scenery where he's configuring, he knows, like, hey, you are in charge of, say, props and the surface on a section of the scene. Then he can optimize for the number of textures being used, the number of materials being used. He'll have control over it. But ideally, all of these things are going to help. When you cover the texturing and the materials part next, you'll understand why we have to keep the lesser materials and lesser number of textures. Okay, it's better. And everything boils down to set pass calls. So keep it below, optimize it, use your frame debugger. There's a tool, frame debugger allows you to, like, understand on what's being used, where are your set pass calls going, what's occupying, why these two are not batched together. It's going to give a lot of cool data. Just have a look at it. You'll be able to understand why these two objects are not rendering, though they are using the same material, but why they're not batched together. Maybe one has shadow enabled, one has shadow disabled. Okay, so they're not going to get batched together. They'll be on a different processing different. So it'll give you that data. It'll say, like, hey, the shadow, the lighting applied is different. This is applied on a different direction light. This is applied to a different direction light. Again, it will not batch it together. So all of these things, the frame debugger will tell you, and then you can act up onto it. Triangle count is something which I think with URP and generally with Unity itself, most of these devices will handle a large amount of triangle count. Okay, triangle has never been an issue. Even in the older consoles, the older PC, you can have 1,000,000 triangles thrown at it. It'll still render it. If you just switch off all the lights, just keep ambient light on, it'll do it. But when you're taking real-time lighting specifically, 150K is a good number. Two things it's going to do, again, from a heating perspective, because for us, thermal heating is extremely important. The more it'll be able to take, say, 300K, 400K, 500K triangles, not an issue. You'll say, yeah, I'm getting 60 FPS even at such a high triangle count. But the computation time from the GPU and the CPU, everything is going to take more. It's going to take more cycles. Everything is going to be more. It'll do all of those operations within 16 milliseconds, but it's going to take more of the juice, right? It's going to make more of the buffers to work. Your buses are going to work more. Individual things, so everything is going to be more processed, and that's why it's going to heat up. So it's a fine balance. 150K is a good number. Not cause heating issues much at all. So that's a number to keep in. The last lever is on your far distance, right? And the far distance, again, from the camera setting is keep it below 100, because that's a good number for it. There are two things what it helps you in. One is on the shadowing Depth accuracy also, it's able to manage it better. So you'll get lesser, those of those lines, the jagged lines and stuff like that. Everything is nicer. But the main is it is going to cull all the objects in a large scenery, right? And that's something is also critical when it comes to how many game objects are being rendered onto your scene. All of this data is, you will notice it, like over here is going to tell you how many draw calls, set pass calls are being used. You just change those camera far keeping plane, it will show you an instant report on how many set pass calls is it using it. So what we usually do is for high to ultra, we have a 100 clipping plane distance. For the low and the very low, we keep it at 50. And we cover the rest of the area with fog. So that's that's like the artist is going to hate it for it, but that's something which you'll have to do for the low-end handsets anyways. Because one is they don't take triangle counts easily. They are expensive. So for a very low end, you have to make sure it doesn't, meaning you don't have huge draw distances. Already covered this on all the stuff. The second most important, maybe what apart from this, is on the post processing, right? All of our titles we use post processing. So the post processing default by on. Okay, for us. For high end to the ultra, post processing is already enabled. Post processing with URP is where the magic is. The URP is great at handling post processing. Okay, thanks to the newer pipeline, it's able to handle it really well even to the medium handsets. So from our medium handsets to the ultra handsets, everything has its post processing on. So in the post processing, we have all the different things. We have color corrections, we have bloom, we have all the beautiness of it. Again, depends on the artist what he likes the art direction needs to be. But post processing is literally meaning, as I say, it's almost free and it gives you with the performance. So do try it, switch it on. It will not cause you heat throttling issues if you follow the rest of the parameters. 150K, lesser material, just all of those parameters we have followed, it should work brilliantly. And it's worked so far for us. We maintain different profiles. Now that's something which we do. We have for every graphics setting, we have a different profile. Okay, and depending on the scene, on the different shaders which are running, right from the water to the character to the lighting, all the different apart. But we use different post-processing profiles for different areas in the screen. But the second main thing is for every, again, device configuration wise, we set up different profiles, all having enabled, like bloom is expensive maybe on some of the low-end handsets. From the medium-end handset, it might cause more heating issues on those. So we enable, disable, create different profiles, and we assign that to it. On medium and low, it's off. We completely switch it off. One is because it's not because you can't take it. Some of these handsets take it. But again, as I said, it's on the entire, how the GPU architecture is, how it's set up. It's going to heat up your handsets, so we switch it off by default. Another main important lever is downsampling. How many of you guys downsample your game? Okay, very few. Okay, do try it out. There's a beautiful function called as set resolution. Okay, it's also you can also configure it via your DPI as well. So this is an old trick, right? From the old, right from the PC game era. You don't have to render everything at 1080p. You can take the same 1080p resolution and you can render it at 720p. You'll not make out the difference. It's very less. And most consoles do it even today. There are a lot of great console technical breakdowns as well. So we do the same thing. We take some of our high-end to very high-end as all at anywhere between 80% to 70%. 70 is the least. Don't go below 70% downsampling. So you can get a 1080p resolution to maybe 720, but don't go below than that. It will start looking weird. But on the Ultra is on native resolution. So the devices which support it, we render everything at native, but have the simple function set resolution. You can set it, configure it on your quality settings inside your game, give the user a chance to like, hey, go on Ultra, put it native On the lesser, you can get it lower. But downsample, don't go below 70 is what I would say. But a downsampling does two things for you. One, it will help you with, again, heat throttling. Okay, when you're heating thermal, it really helps. Okay, making the rendering downsample it to 70% will fix most of the heating issues on most of the use cases. Okay, if it's GPU bound heavily. Okay, so keep that in mind. Downsample, it's not a bad thing. It'll look good, but make sure like you configure it to give the user the opportunity to like change a setting inside your game. As I said, from the frame debug, it's going to give you a different setup onto where each draw call is being broken up, right? And especially this, you have to look at it from when you're using real-time shadows. So when you're using real-time shadows, you look at a breakup, it's going to tell you over there, hey, why this draw call cannot be batched up, okay? It's going to actually tell you. Trust it. Don't assume like it's not, hey, it doesn't make sense. No, I did use the same texture atlas for both these game objects. I did use it, but look at it, study it more. It'll tell you like, hey, you applied different lights to different objects, so it's not going to batch it together. Okay, so pay importance to it, that particular little area. It'll help you to understand, to reduce your set pass calls. You'll be able to take good action towards it. From a scenery culling point of view is again, as I said, right, one thing was on the far clipping plane of your camera, but also what you need to see is how many things you need to render in a scene. And the geometry is pretty, ours is a lot of stuff which is happening in an area scene, what's there. And especially when you have a very detailed environment, as I said, you layer each one, you layer it according to what gets lighting and what gets not. But the main key part is reduce your materials. Okay, do not have excessive number of materials, especially when you're working on a very large scene. And you will address the materials part on the more number of materials is more number of set pass calls. It's very simple. The number of materials increases in combination with your number of lights on the screen. Set pass calls is going to grow exponentially. Okay, so first start off with less number of materials, and then you're adding in more and more lights in your area. From the materials point of view, again, it's on the shader what you're applying, okay, on a game. We use custom shaders as well as with inbuilt URP shaders. By default, whenever you assign a material on a game object, it is set up to lit shader. Okay, first thing you should do is disable it. Okay, first thing. You have to make sure start up with simple lit. Simple lit is the best performance on these variety of handsets you're going to handle it. Again, you don't need to unnecessarily calculate for do a check for, hey, does this material have metal in it or not, or does it have all those different kind of lighting parameters what you need. It's anyway going to go through all of those shader batches. If I said, hey, if your light is important, it's going to check whether it has shininess or not. Okay, and if it's going to have, so it's going to check on all of those things, right? Simple lit will make sure those shader stuff is completely switched off. Okay, it's going to use a very basic lighting. See whether that works. Okay, if your game really requires, say, a lit shader, switch that on. But there's a huge performance difference between, say, a lit and a simple lit. Okay, so start off with default simple lit. You look through the game objects. Only thing what you require, say, a lit shader, you assign that. Else, stay with simple lit. For our games, we use everything is a simple lit. Okay, so right from, it's not like it'll not do shininess or the metal or all the other goodness for the artwork. Everything is there in simple lit as well. Unless you really need it, you should take to the next part. But main is try to get as many different game objects in a single material. So have an atlas. The texture atlas is a very common concept. So use a single texture to have, say, put the props in a single texture. Again, assigned it to a group of objects which will use a similar kind of lighting and shading, put it in a single material. You can then, so that it occupies a single shader as well, you will get those exponential performance boost, if you group it that way. The next important thing is texture compression. How many of you guys use crunch compression? Okay, they're less. So use it. This is the single most thing on helping you reduce the file size. Okay, and for an India market specifically, if you want a lesser file size, use enable crunch compression. Select all your textures. Use crunch compression. Set it at 50% of the results and switch off generate maps. Okay, this is the main parameters what you need to do. Okay, you do this, your file size is going to go down by more than half. Okay, if it's texture intensive. But make sure, like these are like basic. Start working with this. See how the art feels. If it's really bad, then you increase it out. But most of the time, texture compression enabled because, as I said, most chipsets they have a specific texture buffer with the compression enabled, so it will be able to decompress on the fly and render the geometry out of the GPU. Again, profiling analysis, go through it, look at asset loading if you want to really figure out where you're, again, on all what you have. If you have more number of game objects, it's going to give you a lot more data. It's going to look at the timeline view. It's going to give you a breakup of every single millisecond where it's been used. Okay, every single one. It's going to tell you what it is doing. Is it reading? Is it streaming? Did it load it up in memory? What's happening? It's going to give you all of that. So pay attention to that. Look at the timeline view. You can right click on the game objects on a profile. Right click and you say view timeline view. It will give you this view. And then you look at, going to give you individual breakup right from your scripts to your geometry, where it's going, and then you can take action onto it. And that's it. Thanks, guys. I think we don't have much time for questions, but I think maybe one or two questions I can. Yeah. Yeah, sorry. I think mic.
So thank you for your sessions every time.
Hey,
So
thanks.
my name is Prabjeet. I'm coming from TCS. As this session was specifically for mobile devices, and one thing we are forgetting that's on the door is something related to mobile devices. It's virtual reality for again mobile devices. Coming all the way to optimizing and having best performance and maintaining quality is something we have to take care. Again, talking about the resolution of a mobile, it's again this much screen.
Right.
But talking about VR, it's independent.
Yeah.
We can move everywhere, and we have to maintain quality as well.
Sure.
In compared to performance issues.
Right.
So at the end, we still follow some very basic tips like baking lights and
Sure. Right.
and doing the texture resolution like you said.
Right.
So any tips on that for specifically for virtual reality, because that's something a future of mobile gaming.
See, as I would say, the rest of the from a texture compression and the light settings and the render pipeline asset, those all optimization performance things you can easily do. The only thing I think what's
we are
not going to
following as a tradition. So.
Yeah, so that's anyway you can do that, right? Downsampling, again, you can't do much on the VR because it has to be the high resolution.
Yes.
It's going to take 2K resolution
So
each,
the
right? For the each hand.
compromise on quality doesn't need to be there.
Yeah, it shouldn't. I would say avoid larger scenes. Okay, unless we did a bike racing game in VR. Okay, this was, I think we did it almost 2 years back. We didn't have a large draw distance, but I think keeping it within 100 and keeping it high resolution, it'll still work on the VR,
So
on the
again,
stuff.
creating open world games in VR is a hell of a...
It's difficult. Yeah, it's a difficult challenge, and that's where avoid large, long draw distances is all main what you can do, specifically for VR.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Yes.
So sometimes we generate prefabs through scripting.
Yes.
What happens
We do
is
that, yeah.
we get material instances in the hierarchy.
Yes.
So is it okay for like set pass is going to be higher for that?
So what we do is you can group those materials as a shared material. So you can, when you're instantiating, say, a prefab, just make them use the same shared material. That's another step when you're doing, you can do that. So that will make sure like the same material is across. It will not create those multiple. Unity anyway does it on a shade. It enables shared material anyways by default when you instantiate this from the same prefab. But just as a double check, you can do that. That will ensure like there's no multiple materials there. Yeah, we do scriptable, meaning all our stuff is procedurally generated as well on the level part. So, hey, thanks guys. If there's anything, I'm here. So I'm happy to help. Thank you.